The gas station encounter. I had recently moved back to my parents' house after a painful breakup. My life had been thrown off course, and I was now forced to return to the quiet, rural town of Western Massachusetts, far from the city buzz I'd grown used to. The constant isolation felt suffocating, but the only solace was my job at the urgent care facility, which, despite the odd hours, kept me occupied. I often found myself working overnight shifts, which left my sleep schedule in shambles, but it was the only way I could survive until I could get back on my feet. One cold morning, after finishing a grueling overnight shift, I stopped at a local gas station to refuel before heading home. It was around 4:00 a.m., and the town felt deserted. Most businesses were closed, and only the harsh hum of the gas station's lights pierced through the darkness. The station itself was large, but oddly, it was usually empty at this hour. The giant parking lot was barren, save for a handful of parked cars that looked like they hadn't moved in days. It was unsettling, but I was too tired to care. I parked my car at one of the pumps and walked inside to pay. The man behind the counter was half asleep, and he gave me a nod as I handed over cash for the gas. As I made my way back to my car, I noticed another vehicle pulled up at a nearby pump, a blue sedan, old and battered, with a driver that appeared to be in his mid-40s. He was alone. I returned to my pump, still tired and eager to get home. But as I started fueling, I felt his presence. The man from the blue sedan was walking toward me, a strange smile on his face. I tried to ignore him, but his voice rang out. "Want to see a funny trick?" I froze. Something about the way he said it, the casualness in his tone, felt off. My gut instinct screamed at me to walk away, but I didn't. I forced a laugh and replied, "What trick?" He grinned wider, and then began to perform a bizarre, childish trick, pretending to pull his finger off with his other hand. His eyes kept flicking from his hands to me, as though he were trying to gauge my reaction. His grin was unnatural, forced. I looked away, pretending to focus on the gas nozzle, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. But he didn't. The man persisted, repeating the trick over and over, each time with a more insistent, mocking look in his eyes. My unease deepened. Why wouldn't he leave? Finally, the sound of the gas nozzle clicking in place broke the silence. My tank was full. Relieved, I quickly pulled the nozzle out and turned to head inside to get my change. When I came back outside, the man was gone. His car was still parked at the pump, and the gas nozzle was still locked in place, pumping gas into his car. I should have left then, but something felt off, a deep chill running through my bones. I quickly checked my back seat as I got into my car, almost laughing at myself for the paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked the doors, started the car, and pulled away. The drive home should have taken no more than 5 minutes, but I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. No cars were behind me, not even the blue sedan. I felt watched. I arrived home and entered quietly, not wanting to wake my parents. I had a spare key hidden outside, and as usual, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. After a long shift, I was starving, so I made my way to the kitchen to eat. The house was silent, dark, except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Suddenly, I heard the front door creak open. My heart skipped a beat. It was too quiet. No footsteps. No sound of anyone coming in. Just that horrifying click of the door. "Mom! Dad!" I called out, but there was no response. A wave of panic washed over me as I stood frozen in place. My parents were the only ones who had keys to the house, and they always locked the door behind them. So, who was in here? I rushed upstairs to their room and burst through the door. To my relief, they were both asleep in bed, unaware of the intrusion. I stood there for a moment, breathless, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Someone had entered the house. My dad, startled by the noise, immediately jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding in my chest. He checked every room, turning on all the lights. He then stepped outside to check for the spare key we kept hidden. It was gone. I felt sick to my stomach. There was no reason for anyone else to have a key, but the panic was only growing. "Stay here," my dad instructed as he continued searching the house. I couldn't just sit idly by, so I went downstairs to check a few spots I thought he may have missed. I checked under the bed, the closets, but there was nothing. Then, I made my way to the dining room, and that's when I saw him. The man from the gas station. There, crouched under the dining room table, was the same man who had approached me earlier, still grinning, his eyes wide and unblinking. I couldn't breathe. I screamed as loudly as I could, and my mother screamed along with me. My dad came rushing up the stairs, his face pale. The man crawled out from under the table and lunged at my dad, knocking him to the ground. My mother and I rushed forward, hitting the man, trying to get him off my father. It was chaos. But somehow, through sheer force, we managed to overpower him just enough that he scrambled to his feet and ran out the front door. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't process what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare, too surreal to be real. We called the cops, and they arrived quickly, but the damage had already been done. The police found the spare key missing, and a strange sense of unease filled the house. They couldn't find any further trace of the man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been following me. I could only hope the police would catch him before he did this again. That night, my dad wedged a chair under the door handle, a barricade of sorts, and slept in the living room, guarding us from the intruder. The next day, he replaced the locks and made sure the spare key was never left outside again. I felt guilty, knowing it was my carelessness that had put my family in danger. But I couldn't shake the terror that man had caused me. The thought of him following me home, of him being in my house. It haunted me. And I couldn't escape the feeling that, even though we were safe that night, I was being watched. The rest area. Horror. It was the perfect night for a long drive. I had been on the road for hours, the endless stretch of highway ahead of me and the hum of the tires beneath me almost lulling me into a trance. The car's headlights sliced through the dark, illuminating the empty road, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of the highway playing tricks on me. I had been driving through the night, heading to a small town where I planned to spend the weekend with a friend. It was a remote place, far from the bustle of the city, and the road had been eerily quiet for miles. When I saw the sign for a rest area up ahead, I decided it was time to take a break. I pulled off the highway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I entered the empty lot. The rest area was poorly lit, with just a few flickering lamps casting long, ghostly shadows. The restrooms were in the back, a solitary building with cracked windows and peeling paint, looking abandoned at best. A lone truck sat at the far end of the lot, its engine off, the driver nowhere to be seen. I didn't think much of it at first. I needed to stretch my legs and grab a quick snack. Stepping out of the car, the cold air hit me like a slap. It wasn't freezing, but there was a biting chill that seemed to settle into my bones. I glanced around, but the place was still. Not a single sound, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I walked toward the restrooms, the old building looming in front of me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the musty smell of dampness and decay filling my nostrils. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly, casting an uneven glow over the cracked tiles and faded stalls. It felt like stepping into another time, a place forgotten by everyone except the occasional traveller. I went about my business quickly, feeling increasingly uneasy. It wasn't the rest area itself that unnerved me, but the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The silence in the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of my perception. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise, a low, muffled sound, coming from the farthest stall. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the old building, but then I heard it again. A soft shuffling, like footsteps dragging across the floor. I hesitated, my hand still on the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. It was probably just someone else, another traveller, right? But then I realised I hadn't seen anyone else when I entered. The truck outside was empty, no other cars. I swallowed hard, my heart beginning to race. I slowly backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like a low growl. It wasn't an animal, it was human, but distorted, like something was wrong with the voice. something unnatural. Without thinking, I bolted out of the restroom, my feet pounding against the cold concrete as I ran back to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, and I barely managed to get the door open. I slammed it shut, my heart thumping in my chest, and started the engine, the roar of the car breaking the eerie silence of the rest area. But just as I was about to pull away, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing by the restrooms, its back to me, silhouetted against the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin. The figure was hunched over, its head hanging low, as if it were looking at something on the ground. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my stomach turning. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding out of the rest area and back onto the highway. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching me, lurking in the shadows. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road stretched endlessly before me, and the headlights illuminated nothing but darkness. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but every time I looked back, I saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the highway, just out of the light. It wasn't until I finally reached the town that I allowed myself to relax. I pulled into my friend's driveway, my hands still trembling as I turned off the car. But when I stepped out, I froze. There on the front porch was something I hadn't seen before. A small tattered piece of paper was taped to the door. I ripped it off, my fingers numb, and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, jagged, and uneven, like it had been written in a hurry. You shouldn't have stopped at the rest area. It's not safe anymore. They're watching. They know you saw them. My blood ran cold. I looked back down the road, toward the dark stretch of highway, and in the distance, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, I could see something. A figure. Tall. Thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, just like the one I had seen. And as I watched, it slowly turned its head, its empty eyes locking with mine. I backed away from the porch, the paper falling from my hand. The figure took a step forward, then another, and I knew, without a doubt, that the horror I had experienced at that rest area wasn't over. It was just beginning. The desperate stranger. It was a cold, misty evening when I first noticed him. I had just finished my late shift at the local diner, a small, isolated place on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it kept me afloat, just me and a handful of regular customers. The place had a lonely charm, and while I didn't mind the quiet, there were times when it felt eerie, especially after dark. That night, the diner was emptier than usual. Only a few patrons were scattered around, nursing their cups of coffee and flipping through newspapers. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward midnight, and I was cleaning up, preparing to close for the night. That's when I saw him standing outside the diner window. At first, I thought he was just another traveler, maybe passing through town. He was tall, gaunt, with a scruffy beard and ragged clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, stared straight at me, through the glass. There was something unsettling about his gaze, like he wasn't just looking at me, but through me. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't move. He just stood there, his face pressed against the glass, watching me. The mist outside thickened, cloaking the world in a haze of grey. A chill crawled up my spine as I stared back at him. His eyes never blinked. I thought about calling the police, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was his strange, silent presence that made me uneasy, or perhaps it was the fact that he didn't seem like a typical threat. He wasn't acting aggressive, just standing there. But I felt like something wasn't right, that there was danger in the air. Finally, after what felt like hours, he stepped away from the window and started walking toward the door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him approach. I was about to lock up for the night, but he reached the door before I could. He knocked once, softly. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. There was something about him that screamed desperation. but I couldn't tell if that desperation was for help or something darker. I could see his breath fogging up the glass as he waited, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something inside the diner. The street outside was empty. Not a single car passed. Reluctantly, I unlocked the door, pushing it open a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then he spoke. His voice was rough, cracked, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I need a place to stay, just for tonight. Please." He leaned in closer, and I could see the hollow look in his eyes. It was the kind of look that someone might have after seeing things they shouldn't have, something that had broken them in ways words couldn't explain. I glanced back at the nearly empty diner. I knew I should have turned him away. I'd heard enough stories about strangers who preyed on kind-hearted people. But something about him made me want to help. Maybe it was the fear in his voice, the quiet desperation that tugged at my heart. "All right," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "You can sit here for a bit, but we're closing soon." He stepped in slowly, his eyes darting around the diner as though searching for something. I noticed his hands shaking slightly. He took a seat at the far end of the counter, facing the wall. His back was unnaturally straight, his body rigid, like he was afraid to relax. I gave him a cup of coffee, hoping it would calm him down, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he just stared at it, his fingers twitching at his side. I stood behind the counter, watching him cautiously, wondering if I should ask him what had happened to him, or if he was in trouble. But I didn't dare. The air in the diner felt thicker now, the quiet unsettling. A few minutes passed, and then, out of nowhere, he turned to me with wide, frantic eyes. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're following me. They're everywhere." My heart skipped a beat. "Who's following you?" His gaze darted around the diner, his body visibly trembling. He gripped the edge of the counter tightly, his knuckles white. I don't know, but they've been after me for days. I can hear them, in my head. They won't stop. They won't leave me alone." A cold chill ran down my spine. I took a hesitant step toward him, trying to calm him down. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe here. Just take it easy." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild now, panicked, like he was hearing something I couldn't. He began muttering to himself, his words incoherent. "Shh," I whispered, trying to soothe him. "It's okay. You're just tired. You need to rest." His breathing became shallow, erratic. They're right outside," he hissed. "They know where I am. They're coming for me. They never stop. Suddenly, he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in terror. I turned quickly, my heart racing, and looked around the diner. The windows were fogged up from the mist outside, but there was nothing unusual. Then I heard it, faint at first, almost like a low hum, but then it grew louder, sharper, more distinct. It was a whisper, carried on the wind. It sounded like voices, a multitude of voices, coming from outside. The stranger's eyes flickered to the door, then to the window. "No!" he gasped, clutching at his chest. "No! Please, no!" The sound of the voices grew louder, and the door suddenly rattled as if something was trying to get in. I backed away, my heart pounding, trying to understand what was happening. The man stood up, his body jerking violently as if something was controlling him. He reached out to me, his hands shaking. "They're here," he whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with terror. "They're in the walls. They won't let me go." Before I could react, the lights in the diner flickered. The temperature in the room dropped, and a freezing wind howled through the cracks in the walls. I stumbled back, horrified, watching as the stranger collapsed to the floor, his body writhing in pain. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room went silent. The wind stopped howling. The lights steadied. I rushed forward, my hands trembling as I tried to help him, but he was gone, vanished, like smoke. The only thing left was the eerie silence that filled the diner. The door was still locked. The window was still fogged up. There was no sign of anyone outside. But the air felt different now, heavier, thicker, with a presence I couldn't explain. I closed the diner for the night, locking up and trembling in fear, knowing that something had followed me home, that something was still out there. And now, it was waiting. I never saw the stranger again, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just a little too loudly and the shadows seem to linger a little too long, I hear the whispers, the voices, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. And I know that wherever he is, the desperate stranger is still out there, searching for someone else to take his place. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more, and share it with your friends. Your support means the world to me. Stay tuned for more, and remember, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop exploring the unknown.